Hello, this is the next video about your Haydn. I'm going to start off with a recap of what we did last lesson because there was a lot of new information, and I'm using a sheet on the right hand side there with a list of key facts for us to remember. So we'll go through those and use those to try and remember what we learnt last time. So top of the list there is date of composition. This is tricky. We'll look straight across and remember what that is by reading it. 1793. So that's just a fact that has to be remembered. 1793. Who was it performed for? Now you remember that Haydn spent most of his life in Haydn, where he worked for the royal princes, and his music was enjoyed by all of his very wealthy guests. Usually over a dinner or a dance. So it really was just for entertainment there. But this symphony was written when he was in London. So who it was performed for was the London concert-going public. So they would go to a formal concert hall and sit and watch the orchestra playing. So this was performed in London. We don't need to know the detail particularly, but in London and for the concert-going public in a concert hall. How many movements does the clock symphony have? Now, I hope you'll remember that symphony is a piece of work for an orchestra and it has 4 parts to it. So we learnt that the first movement is quite lively, the second one is slow, and our piece is the second movement. So which movement is the andante? It's the second of the 4 movements. What does andante mean? It means to be moving at a walking pace, which certainly in my case is quite slow. So this is the slow movement. 3 facts about the way the Andante's music is written. There were 3 words I really wanted you to try and remember here. It's written in the classical style. Haydn is a classical composer. It's very simple and it's well balanced. Now those words will crop up again, so we're going to try and remember those. Classical, simple and well balanced. So on to the next sheet. When does the tick-tock accompaniment start? Now we had a picture of a clock to try and help us remember the information about this accompaniment. It starts at bar 1, so at the very beginning, and the instruments playing this accompaniment are bassoon and pizzicato strings. So the strings are playing pizzicato, which makes the sound a very short one, and the bassoon is playing staccato as well. If you remember, the things that made the tick-tock accompaniment sound like a clock were having the 2 notes, one lower, one higher. So you can see there on the clock, you've got a picture of what the notes look like when they're written down. You've got the lower one, the higher one, which is a tick, tock, tick, tock, a little bit like a clock. So key facts to remember. Tick-tock accompaniment starts in bar 1. It's played by staccato bassoon and pizzicato strings, and it sounds like a clock because you have 2 notes, one lower and one higher. We then looked in detail at the main melody. This starts 1 bar later in bar 2. So you start off with the accompaniment and then in comes the violins with the main melody. So I've answered a couple of questions there. It starts in bar 2 and it's played by the violins. How long is the main melody? Well, we looked at this because it has 8 bars in total, but it does split nicely into 2 halves. It splits into 2 lots of 4 really nicely because it has a musical question and then it has a musical answer. So it's a really nicely balanced 8-bar phrase, which does split into 2 halves. So that incorporates the next question, what is interesting about the layout of those bars. 4 facts about the main melody. And you might remember we had some different rhythms there in pictures to try and help us remember these. First of all, it's conjunct. You could definitely guess this because it's quite old music. It's definitely not going to be disjunct with notes leaping all over the place. It's a conjunct melody. And then it has dotted rhythms, double dotted rhythms, and acciaccaturas. And those are those really short notes you get before the main note. Do-do, 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 that sort of sound. So those are the key facts we're going to try and remember about our main melody played by the violins. It is conjunct, dotted rhythms, double dotted rhythms, and acciaccaturas. So how many times does this main melody appear in the andante? It comes back 3 times in the andante. Actually, that's not true. It is played 3 times. So the first time is one of those. Each time it comes back, it has some slight changes, and Haydn experiments with different accompaniments, slightly different rhythms, and certainly it's often played by different instruments as well. So that is what Haydn does to change the main melody. This type of structure in a piece of music is called theme and variations, where the main melody is called the theme and the slightly different versions of it are called the variations. So we can say the piece has the structure, theme and variations. Finally, as well as the tune coming back a number of times, Haydn also has some contrasting music, and he does all sorts of things that we're going to learn more about to create this contrast and make the music slightly more interesting. If it was just made up of the same melody, it would get a bit boring for the listener, but actually he liked the element of surprise. And one of the things that he does to create some contrast is to use a minor key, where he surprises the listener with the brass and the timpani, and it's suddenly much, much louder. So he does that to create contrast at different points in the piece of music, but there's one in particular where it is in a minor key, very loud, with the use of brass and timpani, which, as you know, we're not playing at the beginning at all. So those are the main facts about our andante. I would like to now move on to some of the elements of music as we looked at with the face, and today we are going to start off with instrumentation. There we go. So, instrumentation in the Haydn, in the andante. We are going to first look at the orchestra that was used by Haydn. Now, as you know, this was a long time ago. This piece of music was composed in, let's see if you remember, it was composed in 1793. So the orchestra was a little different, and as you remember from looking at the video last week, the instruments looked a little different as well. So you'll see that the simple classical orchestra, now those are 2 of those words we're trying to remember, classical and simple. They had strings, same as now, but probably just fewer of them. They had a complete woodwind section, so all of the usual instruments. They had 2 of each, so flutes, oboes, clarinets only just, clarinets were very new at this time, and bassoons. And then they had 2 trumpets and horns as well. So they did not have trombones. Trombones were not in the classical orchestra. So that's the main difference in the instruments, except if you look at the percussion section, it's vastly different. So they have 2 timpani and that's it. So they have none of the additional percussion instruments that we know about. The timpani as well were very different to how they are these days. So you would have 2 drums only, and as you know, orchestras these days will have about 4 different timpani drums with somebody sat between them all. So here they only had 2, and they did not have the pedals that they do now, so you could only play the note of the drum. So in this piece of music, it used just G and D. Now you might remember from last time that the key is, the music is in the key of G. So this has got the main note, the G, and also the 5th note of the scale, G, A, B, C, D, which is called the dominant. So we have 2 timpani drums playing only 2 notes, G and D. So that's the classical orchestra. It's a simple classical orchestra using the strings, all the same woodwind, brass except no trombone. Oh, and I could point out no tuba. And then percussion, the only percussion instruments are the 2 timpani drums in G and D. The next point about instrumentation is the use of techniques. Now, as you know from the beginning in the tick-tock accompaniment, we heard pizzicato. We also heard in the violin melody the use of the bow, so that's arco. So we can also mention the techniques that we know. The next fact about the instruments is that two of the instruments in this piece are transposing instruments. Now, transposing means that the instrument is actually built in a slightly different key to the others. So, as you know, with the piano, if you go along and you play a C, there's your middle C written down next to the piano, it will sound like a C. Whereas if you play a transposing instrument and you play what is a C, it will come out differently. So it's written in a different key, and the thing you need to know about that is that when you see the music written down, it will have different notes to the other instruments. So if you look at those two notes written there, those both sound like C's, but they're certainly not written like them. So your clarinets and your horns will have different notes written, and you might also spot they have a different key signature. The key signature here with the two flats there. That means they'll play the same notes as the piano with no flats. So those are the two key facts. We have transposing instruments, clarinets and horns, which have different notes written and a different key signature. So that's a completely new fact for you. One more mention on the brass instruments. Now, we did look at this on the video. The instruments have a slightly different look about them because they were historic ones in the video. These natural trumpets from this age had no valves. So if you can picture a trumpet, usually you've got these three valves on the top, which your fingers use to play the different notes. These ones didn't have any. So literally the player would not be able to play all of the notes of the scale. So what would typically happen is that the brass instruments would play a role almost a bit like a fanfare, where they could only play the notes of the triad. So they would play the do 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 do, those sorts of notes, but they couldn't play scalic melodies using all of the notes. So that's a key difference in the use of the brass instruments, which makes a difference to the music that Haydn could write for them. So, instrumentation. We have a simple classical orchestra, two of our key words. We have normal strings, normal woodwind, just trumpets and horns. So the lower ones, the trombones, the tubas, they're not there. And then finally, just two timpani drums in G and D. We have noticed that the strings use arco and pizzicato as techniques. We know that two of the instruments are transposing instruments. They're the clarinets and the horns, and they have different notes written down and different key signatures. Last of all, we know that Haydn used older instruments which had different features. So the brass instruments, for example, didn't have any valves, so they couldn't play all the notes of the scale. They could only play the notes of the triad. So a lot of information there. I shall stop this video and I will post a new one with the last two elements of music that we're going to look at.